All right. Thank you for joining another MMA Chats, the Pragmatic Christian. Just kidding. I don't want to go that over the top. But all right.
Well, it is Sunday.
Yeah.
Pull back. Traffic at the 9s and 5s.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for a special event. We have Hayden Bruce, Samuel Bruce, Hayden Samuel.
Hayden Samuel Bruce. Three first names.
And he's going to go ahead and run our first time ever Pragmatic Christian MMA chat. And thank you all for joining. If you guys have any questions during anything, I will be addressing those in the chat. I'm actually taking a minimalist approach here. So Hayden will actually be running most of this conversation almost completely. You'll probably hear me at the beginning and end, and possibly some weird jokes thrown in, but you won't hear a lot from me. But Hayden, go ahead and take it away. And before we do that, let's go ahead and introduce everybody. Hayden, go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I am Hayden Bruce. I am the host of the Pragmatic Christian podcast. I've been in the mixed mental arts group probably for the last 2 years. I honestly don't even know. And while we do this introduction, since this is the MMA Pragmatic Christian chat, how about you introduce yourself and your relation to or lack thereof to Christianity or religion in general, just so we can kind of know where everyone's standing. For myself, I grew up in a Christian family my entire life. The specific flavor of Christianity was Pentecostal. I was in something called the Assemblies of God. So speaking in tongues, not quite ever snake handling, but lots of very over spiritual services, miracle services, the whole deal. That's what I grew up with. I grew up, knowing that one day I'm going to speak in tongues. I have spoken in tongues, done the whole thing. That's been my life. And then I ended up going to college to kind of be equipped to, become a church planter and a missionary. And then things kind of started to deconstruct from there. And I kind of went on a journey, which I talk about all the time on the podcast. But I'm coming from a Pentecostal Christian upbringing, and now I got the podcast, and I'm involved with MMA and trying to process and work out what it looks like to be a Christian today with everything that we know about psychology, evolutionary psychology, just where we are in culture and technology and science and our understanding. How can we authentically or genuinely, intellectually, honestly, be religious or be a Christian? I'm really interested in those questions. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and kind of the basis of my podcast and my work. So that's me. We can introduce Drew. This is actually the guy who produces my show, Drew Borowski, if you want to introduce yourself.
You are listening to the Pragmatic Christian chat group. My name's Drew Borowski, so I've been producing his podcast. It's been a blast, and I joined the MMA group just before we had started this and have been silently observing and enjoying everything that you guys have been doing while piecing it all together with him to make it broadcastable. But it's been super fun. We were in the nursery together. We grew up in the same church background. I actually do media at my church right now. And still trying to include as much as I can of the religious tradition I was handed while accepting new information as it comes in.
Mm-hmm.
which is a challenge sometimes, but it's good and healthy.
There we go.
All right.
So
Great.
we can go down the line. Maybe Adam can go.
Adam the Handsome Hansen.
Gosh. I can't get it to unmute. There we go. Did it unmute?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
All right.
Oh,
All
we
right.
hear you.
So Adam Christian Hansen, because Hansen itself apparently wasn't Danish enough. And I grew up in the Mormon faith, fourth generation. Great grandpa was the convert and immigrant from Denmark. I was an active Mormon until my late 30s, when then it kind of all fell apart. I served my mission, as many of you know Mormons do, to Ecuador when I was a young man. And so really great experience, learned Spanish. I still try to keep my Spanish language capability going.
¿Cómo estás?
Estoy muy bien. Ando super chévere, listo para una conversación super buena. Sorry about that. What's interesting is so many people who have left the Mormon Church have made a beeline straight to atheism, and that didn't really make much sense to me. I'm cool not having the answers. I think one of the great things I was able to let go was needing to know things that are just, almost impossible to answer. And I guess I just have enough trust and faith in the overall experiment of life that I'm cool not having the answer. So I refer to my belief structure now as seeker without portfolio. And I still draw great sustenance from the Christian traditions. I view it very differently now. Of course, I'm not so literal about so much of it. I try really to understand what's really behind some of the things, particularly within the New Testament. Really understand time, place, what was going on, what was the context. What would that be like now if the parables were repurposed for our day? What would pack the same kind of punch for us now, etc. But I also have benefited from studying Buddhism and Hinduism, and meditation is an important part of my life now, and it actually helps me with a monkey mind that normally might just totally take over. So that's my story.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Did you want to go up next, Chris?
Oh, he might have a different line.
Can you hear me now?
We
Yep.
can hear you.
All right. Mine's Chris Cole. I was raised in a generational Christian household, and that had a very literal interpretation of the Bible. It's a Bible college. I have brothers that are ministers and work in tech in the church field, and one's a missionary, and I went to Bible college for a little while myself. Coming from a background where everything was so very literal, and it doesn't reconcile well with much of what the world, what we find out in science, or what we find out in learn about ourselves through evolution or psychology and things of that nature. If the Earth's only 8,000 years old, that brings some problems. So I think I've evolved to being more of a agnostic Christian. I believe, I have a set of beliefs that are foundationally Christian, my morals and things of that nature. But I also have come to believe that, the most flawed thing about Christianity is men, and that sometimes when men are grasping at trying to understand things, they don't always get it right. So I think that in the postmodern world where we can look at things and and have a more fluid idea about these stories and these things that we've told ourselves, that doesn't necessarily make them lose any of their importance or any of the significance or the lessons that they teach us, but it's definitely a different type of belief, and it's not particularly popular. I've been called a heretic before, and will probably be called one again. So, but that's kind of me in a nutshell. And I'm happy to be here.
Right on.
Awesome.
Sean?
Thanks for sharing.
Sure, I'll go next. Yeah, I'm happy to be here as well. Glad to be with you, gentlemen. I've been very fortunate to have two of you on my podcast. I have one as well, inspired by the MMA one. I remember starting listening to the Brian Callen show when it was the first time it was a Brian Callen show, and from I think like episode 6 or 7, and just really was enamored with everything that the show was about the discussions and the pursuit of really diving into deeper some of these really awesome concepts around whether it was Jonathan Haidt or Davis H. Wilson or any of these things. I've always been a big, heady kind of person. Grew up, so I guess I'm the oddball of the group a little bit. That I grew up in a house that was anything but religious. As some of you know, it was not Christianity or any religion for that matter was not looked upon favorably at all, and was quickly pointed out for all the fallacies and the ridiculous nature of it. This coupled with the Jimmy Bakkers and Jerry Falwells of the world, and then just the fallen nature of those around me growing up in the South, growing up in Houston, where it wasn't, if you went to church, it was what church did you go to? And so being the oddball growing up that didn't go to church at all was very, so, and then you saw the hypocrisy. And I think most of us, there's that science, that logical part of us that it doesn't really matter what it is, but when it doesn't play out and it doesn't ring true in the action and the words are different, that you don't have to be the most intelligent person in the world to have a difficult acceptance of that, especially when it comes around morals and ethics and things like of that nature, which you don't have to be very smart to understand what those mean in terms of intelligence. And so I was very happy and very content with not having any beliefs. And then I was always one trying to read and learn again and all this rest of stuff. In my very early 30s, I had I don't want to say a crisis, but definitely years of a couple bad decisions, failed marriage, and then just a bout of materialism that came up short. That all these things that I had looked at were supposed to bring me contentment, supposed to bring me success, supposed to bring me some level of comfort around things and jobs and relationships and all this other stuff, and it just none of it rang true. And then had a guy reach out and ask me about my relationship with Jesus, and my first thought was, oh my God, here we go with one of these guys again. He's going to try and tell me about this fairy tale and all this other stuff. And then for whatever reason, there's a little voice in my head that just said to listen. I think mainly because the guy who asked me, I knew I had a relationship with him. He was, and I knew that in his heart of hearts, he was a decent person, and he wasn't trying to check a box. He wasn't trying to, win over and have some sort of, spiritual scorecard on me. That he was really, truly concerned about me, and it gave me pause. And it just, I was like, okay, well, I'll listen to be nice, and then that just set me on a journey that convinced me to, take that leap of faith. That to a little bit what Hayden talked about. A little bit of what Adam was alluding to about this. We have this pursuit that we all want to know things, and then to know everything, and have the ultimate truth, and have the ultimate revelation, regardless of what it is, so that we have that comfort of knowing something. And I just have become more and more convinced of the latter. And I use, as many of you know, I like to use Adam's phrase that he put on my podcast, and that is just, I'd rather be effective than right. And to me, I've kind of morphed that a little bit in my head to, instead of judging me by what I believe, just, judge me by what I do. And then we can talk about beliefs and that kind of thing. And so, religion's always been a fascinating thing to me. And now I find it dominates pretty much every thought in my head every day. I was telling you guys earlier that I was reading that book on Audible, and I went and looked up the title. It's called "The Nazi and the Psychiatrist," Ermond Goering, Dr. Douglas Kelly, and a fatal ending or meeting of the minds at the end of World War II. And what reason that kind of resonated with me around this a little bit too was I had a gentleman on my podcast a while back, and he made the point that going into World War II, 93% of the German population were considered Christians. And so, there's a lot of history. There's a lot of, and I've been to Europe a couple of times recently, been there many times before that. There's a lot of hangover with that word. I'm sure even in the MMA community, this talk and putting that out there almost might seem a little bit ridiculous. And how could a bunch of, intelligent, smart people still be talking about this, this silly theology? And so it's just part of it. But I think all discussions like this are worth having. That's the basis of my podcast and what I try to do. And so with that, I love taking the time to be around you guys and those that I know and those that I don't. So I'm looking forward to it.
Right on. How about the new guy who just joined us?
Chris number 2.
Chris number 2.
Chris number 2. Hey, sorry. I was just listening there. What's up, everybody? I'm Chris. Longtime Mixed Metal Arts fan. Podcast stuff. I've done a few of these chats before. I don't know anybody here except for maybe Adam, but and obviously Dusty. Anyway, looking forward to what everybody has to say regarding Christianity. Myself, grew up in a very Irish Christian household. Did the whole went to church every Sunday. Was actually an altar boy for about a decade. Even went to Paris to meet the Pope and all that kind of fun stuff. Later in my 20s, became an atheist after all that, and then slowly, as I've gotten older, have kind of crept back to religion, or just not crept back to it, but I'm not dismissive of it as I used to be. I'm not super religious, but I like not just hearing about Christianity. I like hearing about all religious, and I find religion fascinating, and I just like to talk about it. That's it.
Right on. All right. So this is everyone that we have. Christopher number 2. What's your last name?
Niles.
Niles.
Yeah, like Niles from Frasier or The River.
Right on.
What about my story?
Oh yeah.
Of course, the one forgotten. Well,
we don't got your face. We just got a logo, an outdated logo.
Disembodied voice.
Oh, there's a reason, but I'm not going to go into it. And then we have Andrew, who could talk about himself after me. But yeah, pretty short. My mom, she was raised by Puerto Rican parents, being Latin American, very deeply Catholic. And then she moved, had us, and when she moved here, she joined a different church, which was a Dutch Reformed church. And then my stepdad kind of had the background of, the Southern Baptist Methodist. So I was able to see like the two dichotomies of, how a church congregation can be run. But until I was 18, I'd say, and if you haven't been to like a black church, it's pretty fun. Lots of song and dance, and probably pretty close maybe to the Pentecostal style of worship. But well, anyway, we found a church nearby that was a Dutch church. So it's like a bunch of people, like super tall white people with like Vander last names, last names that go Vander something. And then we were in that church for quite a while, for 18 years. So I grew up going to church every Sunday. I think once I got to high school, I wasn't quote unquote required to go to church. And that was mainly because of football season, and I'd be like extremely battered for the weekend. So I couldn't really walk around in comfort too much. But we grew up poor, so we have a lot to thank for the church. They went so far out of their way to help us. And so far as in they actually provided provided housing for us for like a year and a half.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, I grew up, you know, I started not attending and becoming more apathetic. And then I just kind of switched to an atheist. There was this movie trailer I saw. This sounds so innocuous. It was a movie trailer for Sleepy Hollow with what's his name, Johnny Depp, and there was a quote in the trailer. He says, "I am a man of science," and I was like, "Damn, that's pretty hardcore." So I kind of I kind of adopted that as my mantra and just kind of, you know, floated away from religion and became kind of anti-religion in some respects. Um, then I just started, you know, shitting away this anti-religion mindset because there were also some conspiracy theories that went into my head that had to do with religion and how it was some type of brainwashing. But anyway, further along, I joined mixed martial arts. I start to see religion in a different way and how it positively helped me as a child. You know, everything came full circle. I do know that the merits of religion, whatever it may be, do have incredible positive impacts on how a group of people can cooperate and just like live together well. It's very hard for science to come up with something that rivals that aspect that science doesn't seem to understand a whole lot of. And
Unless you're
another
Sam
thing,
Harris.
yeah. And yeah, I'm just like pointing to Jonathan Haidt and his work on moral psychology. And another reason I don't dismiss Christianity, I guess I would say, is because our whole cultural morals are basically based on it. I can't say that it has no merit. Like, even though I may not believe in God, you know, I might be an agnostic atheist, but I can't deny the social constructs that religion has given my environment for us to cooperate, even though we might not be specifically religious. And on that end, you know, I've also been exploring other things, such as just listening to some sermons from some imams. And I was like, wow, this is basically like a Christian sermon. There's not a whole lot different between what an imam in a moderate religious setting in his own sermons. They're very much similar to Christian sermons. And, you know, that's one of the things I'm exploring is just how similar these religions have when it comes to expressing their moral and their moral philosophy. But yeah, that's my story.
Right on. Well, now we got Andrew, who is coming prepared for church. He's getting in the right mindset, it looks like. Communion, right?
Yep. You want me to share my history with religion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Brief history of religion.
Okay. Well, I've talked about this many times before, but for those who don't know, I was raised as a Christian by ministers, and I guess their interpretations of Christianity are pretty progressive, which I realized as I was growing up, and much more when I became an adult. And so they don't follow like the kind of like typical Christian doctrine that much, especially since their views changed, and they used to have more traditional views too. But pretty much I would say that the only part of Christianity that they follow is that Jesus was a pretty admirable person, and they believe in some form of God. I think they believe that God is a woman. And so when I was growing up, it was interesting to interact with other children and hear like especially because I grew up in a culture that's very like traditional and conservative, and those dripped into their interpretations of Christianity. So I was dealing with a lot of like stereotypical interpretations of it. Like I had other kids when I was growing up say things like, if you don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell. So I eventually, I guess when I was a teenager, I started questioning religion because my parents, I guess maybe a handful of years earlier, they ended up leaving their church because they performed a wedding for a lesbian couple. And at the time, that was in line with the rules for their church, the United Church here in Canada, which is it's I think it's a particularly Canadian denomination, which is a combination of I forget which other churches it's a combination of it, but if it's a combination of like 3 other denominations. So that it was in line with the rules for that church, but it was still gay marriage was still illegal in Canada at the time, and people complained, and they ended up just leaving because they thought that they were going to be asked to resign. And so we started going to the Presbyterian church instead. And a few years later, I learned the word agnostic for the first time from a minister, ironically, in a sermon. And I guess a few years after that, when I was a teenager, I started learning about atheism. And then, kind of similar to Dusty's story, I ended up following, like, you know, the 4 horsemen, like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, and I eventually became a militant atheist. And then, I guess a little bit before Mixed Mental Arts, how you and I got to know each other, Hayden, is you got interested in some of my writing when I was becoming much less militant about my atheism. And we became friends through our bonding of, I guess, you becoming less of a fundamentalist Christian and me becoming less of a fundamentalist atheist. And then now, through Mixed Mental Arts and communicating with people, I've developed more sympathy for religious perspectives, I would say.
Right on. So I don't think there's anyone else. Am I okay? You guys can all hear me, right?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. I wasn't sure if I was still muted. So this is, the Christian chat. So we're going to talk about Christianity. Christianity, started in, the first century of the, I think it's CE or whatever, after Christ. It branched out of Judaism, and specifically in a time where the Jews just came out of exile. They were roaming around all over the place. They left Egypt as slaves. They roamed for all these years, and then eventually became these tribes, and then eventually became a pretty respectable kingdom. And then, as the stories go in the Old Testament, their hubris pretty much brought them down. You have all these prophets, telling them that they need to stop associating with other gods and other people. And, if you don't, then God's going to wipe you out. They apparently didn't listen because Babylon came through, or was it Persia first? I think it was Persia first, and then Babylon. Either or. Both had their way with the Jews or the Hebrews at that time. And so now you have the Jewish exile, and then you have, several hundred years of being in exile, and their entire worldview, their entire idea of how to relate to God was all wrapped up with the temple. You had to have a temple in order to give your sacrifices, and that's how you relate to God. And so now that they're in exile, there was no temple. So you have this period of time where, you know, they literally didn't know how to relate to God. They didn't know how to, you know, give sacrifices, or if they even could, or, you know, are they forsaken by God, or can they redeem themselves? And so you have this like period of time where those questions are being asked. And so you have all this really interesting apocalyptic literature coming out of this time. You have all these wisdom traditions coming out of this time. And you have this rabbinical tradition come out of this time. There wasn't any rabbis before that exile. And so you have this rabbinic tradition come out of this exile, which was basically all of these, you know, Jewish philosophers, you know, working out, you know, this oral tradition because they couldn't follow the law because they had no temple. So now they're trying to come up with all this, you know, wisdom tradition, all these, you know, how can we relate to God in this way? And it's, you know, it would take volumes and volumes and volumes long to cover the rabbinical tradition, because it's all these sayings and all this, you know, in this situation, what do we do? In this situation, what do we do? And so by the time, you know, Rome is in charge, they, you know, there's this long period of this rabbinical tradition, and, you know, the Jews were able to reconstruct a temple eventually, but you have Jews that are spread out all over the region. So like a lot of them would come trek to the temple, but a lot of them started to have their own, you know, little traditions here or there. And so the people closer to the temple would look at the people outside of that region, and they would basically look at them like fundamentalists today would look at liberals. Like, you're not really Christians. You don't really, you know, believe in God. You guys are doing your own thing. And so you have these Samaritans, and you have all these different people, you know, that are wrapped up in this, you know, in this ethnic, you know, group. And so out of all of these, you know, religious, existential, political, ethnic, all these different factors, you have this rise of the idea of the Messiah, the one that's going to make everything right, the one that's, you know, in the line of David, King David, who's a big deal, and in the line of Moses, you know, he's going to be the new Moses, the new Adam, the first man who's going to come, and he's going to basically set all this shit right. You know, he's going to make, you know, he's going to make the Hebrews, you know, a strong kingdom once again. And he's going to right the relationship between the Jews and God, and they're going to eventually cover the earth and all this different stuff. There's all these different traditions. During the time of Jesus, you know, the Roman Empire is in charge. There's actually multiple people who have stepped forward as Messiah. So it's really interesting in this history. You have all these different Messiahs pop up. So you have the Maccabees Messiah. I think there's several of them. You have all these different people who are like, you know, I'm the Messiah. They do cool stuff. They're really charismatic. A lot of them are military, you know, people or badasses, and they get like a group of people who basically all rise up and are like, yeah, this guy's the Messiah. And so you have all these Messiahs come up and, you know, basically try to start a coup against Rome, and it never ends up well. They always get annihilated. And so it's like, okay, that guy wasn't the Messiah. Okay, we got a new Messiah. Okay, he died. He's not the Messiah. And then we got another guy. And then all of a sudden you have this Jesus guy come on the scene, and he's a rabbi, and he, without getting too deep in the specifics, he ends up choosing his disciples in a way that is very different than the way rabbis normally choose their disciples. He's very different than other rabbis for a lot of different reasons. But you have this guy come up, and he isn't a military figure or some badass who wants to, you know, rage against Rome, even though that's what his disciples think he's doing. You know, he's talking about peace and love, and the kingdom of God is for those that are meek and peaceful and loving. And if you don't have love, then you don't know God. And he's saying all these things, and he's constantly being misunderstood. And then eventually, as you know, as we all are familiar with the story, he ends up, dying on a cross, just like all those other messiahs. So all his disciples, forsake him. He is just a passing thought. It's like, oh, well, we thought he was the Messiah, and I guess not. And then something different happened. Something very different happened than from all the other messiahs. All the other messiahs were kind of forgotten, and then you kind of look for a new one. Something happened, after Jesus died, where people were like, hey, that guy that died like all the other messiahs? I think something different was going on there. Now we have, the literature from the New Testament. You have these letters, from after the fact, from within a time period of, it's debated, but one of the earliest letters is actually from Paul, who I think it was written in the 50s or 60s. But you have all this literature, and it's all popping up after the fact, after this, this Jewish rabbi died. But something different happens. For some reason, this guy's not only life, but death, which would be a failure, was compelling enough to these people to give their lives to this person. For some reason, he lived in such a way and died in such a way that after his death, it was as if he was resurrected. And you have all these stories, popping up. And in the four gospels themselves, you have all these inconsistencies. And it's really interesting in church history. There's been people trying to get the church to kind of make a single mono version of the gospel. Like, let's put all the gospels together and agree on the story, and we'll just have one. And every single time that's been proposed, the church has said, no, we're keeping the inconsistencies, which that's a really interesting thing that we might talk more about later. But you have this guy who lived in such a way that was compelling enough for these people to basically give their entire lives to and die by Romans in love of and worship of. So it's really interesting. And, I have no idea what happened. I was raised to believe that man was God. He was God incarnate in a unique way that never happened before. I was taught to believe that, if I didn't say out loud with my words that he was God and the King and Lord of my life, then I was going to spend eternity in eternal conscious torment in the hellfires of hell. I was taught to believe that. And throughout the last 2,000 years, there's all these different beliefs and traditions and conversations about who this person is. And to this day, 2,000 years later, we have all these doctrines popping up all over the place, but people do not agree on who he is. People do not agree on who this Jewish rabbi was, who lived and died, who basically failed. He failed in compared to the way that they thought, the Messiah was supposed to come. And if you were to ask like the Jews today, they would say he doesn't meet the requirements for Messiah. They have all this literature that this guy's supposed to meet. He needs to meet these requirements to be Messiah. And if you were to ask Jews today, they don't think that Jesus met those requirements.
What are those requirements?
What are those requirements? Oh, I don't know. I'm not Jewish. You have all this prophetic literature in the Old Testament, but as a lot of us know, the Old Testament, the Christian Bible, was assembled, a couple hundred years after, the death of Jesus. And there's all these other traditions. You have the, apocalyptic tradition like Baruch and Ezra, and you have Judith, and all the, even the Catholics have a couple books in the Bible that I've never read because it wasn't in the, Protestant tradition. So the point is, you have all these different traditions. You have all these disagreements. You have all of these ideas, thoughts, arguments, all surrounding the person of Jesus of Nazareth, this guy who, apparently was born in a manger and born of, two low income parents, and there's all these reasons why this guy should not be God by any stretch of the imagination. And 2,000 years later, you have this huge long history of people trying to figure out who the hell this guy was and why was he so important, and why did his little group, his little movement grow from like 30 people to millions in 300 years. The early Christians were actually the first people, I think the first people, if not one of the first people, to be called atheists. Like the Romans called Christians atheist because they looked to this Christ as God instead of believing in all these other gods. And so they're like, the Christ hypothesis was basically, no, we're going to focus all of our attention on this one God who came, incarnate in the person of Christ instead of worshiping all these gods. And the way that they believed back then was very different from what we think of belief or religious belief today. The way that we think about religion, the idea of believing in God, believing that there's this spirit or being, is as recent as the Enlightenment. So like the last 200 or 300 years, back then to believe in the gods for like the Romans and the Greeks, to believe in those was, the same as believing that there's a waterfall or there's rain, or they're just so completely intertwined that if you were to believe in the rain, you were to believe in gods. And one of the big other reasons that the Romans just were like, no, this guy couldn't possibly be a god, is that the gods to them did not care or, God forbid, love human beings. They were completely separate. Like the idea that the gods would care about the human beings at all, they have their own stuff to worry about and to, fight over and, to take care of. Why the heck would they come here to die for human beings? That's ridiculous. So all of that is to say that there's 2,000 years of thousands and thousands of traditions and denominations and sects and all these different people, millions of people throughout the last 2,000 years who all disagree about the person of Christ. There's a neurologist, a neuroscientist, I should say, Andrew Newberg, who studies the effects of belief and religion on the human brain. And there's been studies done where they ask children and adults and all these different people in different settings to describe who God is. And basically, to cut to the point, if you were to ask even 1,000 people within the exact same tradition. So let's just take, Baptist, Christian, in the same city, in the same town. If you were to ask them to describe God, besides just doctrinal definitions, you would get different versions from all of them. So there's something about belief that is very, very personal, even when it's super social, even when it's super you have to agree on the same doctrine. It's very, very personal. Everyone's got would describe God in a different way. And it's also interesting that when you describe God as a child, that description changes as you get older. Usually as a kid, it's very much like a concrete person, like an old man with a beard in the sky. And then as you get older, it becomes more ethereal, more, you start to picture clouds or a spirit. You don't really know how to put that in words. So even, the same person's idea of God changes over time, just naturally, as you gain vocabulary, understanding about the world. So our ideas, you could take everyone that believes in God or everyone that believes in Jesus, and they're all going to have a very personal definition or experience or vocabulary to attach to that concept or that person or God or spirit. So it's a very personal thing. It's a diverse thing, and it's a contested thing for the last 2,000 years. So with all that in mind, let's figure it out right here in this group. Let's get down to exactly what it is, what it means, and, I guess we can go from there and tell everyone about it.
Solving the world's problems.
We'll solve Christianity. So that's kind of, the intro. It's something that's been disagreed about forever, since the beginning, since Jesus came on the scene. During his own life, everyone disagreed about what he was doing and what he meant and what his life was about. And then he died, and then people disagreed about what it was. But even within all that disagreement, which I think if you do an honest look at the history of this whole thing, that disagreement seems to be just as fundamental to Christianity from where I'm standing as any of the agreement, any of the worship, any of the prayer. If you were to do a history or a study, a deep, in-depth study of the history of Christianity, you could very well call it a history of disagreement. From day one, it's been contested. From day one, people have been arguing. And so out of that arguing that started from the very beginning, you have this really rich, diverse theological tradition. And all those arguments are always really grounded in who the hell is Jesus Christ? Who was he? People have been trying to figure that out. The smartest, most devout Christians have been trying to figure out just who he is for 2,000 years. So we're not going to figure out who he is. We're not going to know exactly who the hell Jesus is or what he was or how, if at all, he was God. But like everyone within this tradition that I've been talking about, we're going to inevitably use the vocabulary, the cultural understanding and symbols of our time to do so. That's all theology is using the language, the culture, the technology, the vocab of their own specific time to discuss who Jesus is, who God is to them in their time. From Paul Tillich to Schleiermacher to Martin Luther to John Calvin to Aquinas to every single theologian is doing the job of using their own cultural time and symbols and language to describe who God is to them at that time. That being said, every single Christian who has, we would say now, progressed Christianity forward has been described as a heretic. Jesus himself was a heretic. Martin Luther, who was a huge part of the Reformation, was a heretic. So it's a history of disagreement and it's a history of heretics. That is what Christianity is on one level. All that being said, does anyone have any comments or anything that you'd like to say? Adam.
I have two questions. First was just quickly, I wanted to ask Andrew. Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah.
You said that you were raised by ministers. Did you get to see your parents very often?
Yeah. They actually they shared they shared one full-time position wherever they would preach, so that they could have a lot of time to raise my brother and I, particularly for my mom, at least, because her father was a minister and he was full-time, and he always devoted himself to the church to the extent that he never saw his children that much. So my mother wanted to do the opposite of what her father did in that sense.
I was having some fun with you. When you said you were raised by ministers, I thought, man, what a weird religion. Like, what happens with the parents? Anyhow, Hayden, my second question is, when's the midterm?
When's the midterm?
I'm just kidding. You're dropping some serious science, brother. I love it. I love the context. And I just wanted to honestly, my honest comment was about the word heretic, which comes from the Greek. What? Anyone? Heresis, I think.
Heresis.
Which means choice. And so I would just say,
oh, that's interesting.
Any kind of Christianity or any religion that is going to be successful in the future has to figure out a way not to be threatened by choice.
Yeah.
And so again, how can you have enough in common so that there's value in coming together, but then even, Paul talked about, the different gifts of the Spirit, and the, one body part doesn't say to another body part, I really don't need you. The body of Christ, or the body of any congregation, any, basically any religion, has to figure out a way to use all these different gifts and capabilities, and really get clear on what the non-negotiables are. And hopefully that's a shorter list, but there's greater devotion to them. And then for all the negotiables, I think we all have to be willing to give each other just plenty of space for that. It's just kind of human nature to try to pin down everything, make everything so safe, so prepackaged and everything. And Hayden, I shared with you, that great William James quote that talked about, I don't have it memorized, but it's almost the nature of humans to see an original religious insight, and then as a religion starts to get traction, it will, as quickly as possible, become its own rigid orthodoxy, which quits drinking from that original spring of insight and religious genius, essentially. So that's my comment. I was just having some fun with you guys.
Yeah,
like
that's why Hayden, one of the things I appreciate about you in our communication with each other is that pragmatic aspect of pragmatic Christianity and William James and all that kind of stuff, which is why communicating with you and other people in mixed mental arts has helped me shift my perspective on religion to the point that what matters much more than what people believe is what they do with those beliefs.
Yeah.
Sean, thank you for sharing that Jews for Judaism link. I think you're going to dig that, man. I was looking at it a bit, and it just goes through all the criteria for you.
Hey, Hayden, I have a question.
Yeah.
All right, during my conspiracy days, I was reading a lot of, I guess, pseudo-historical books about the possibilities of Jesus and how he may have lived, and, trying to contextualize the politics into a more pragmatic nature. But one of the questions I have is if Jesus was indeed a rabbi, and this is one of the things that I find puzzling as well. If he is a deeply religious rabbi, at that time, I believe claiming to be like the embodiment son or representative of God in such a way would have been blasphemous to his religion. So there's a lot of, what I've read a lot of is that it is highly unlikely that a deeply religious rabbi would make those types of claims.
Yeah. There's some really recent papers that have been done recently kind of exposing that exact thing. If you were to read the actual Greek of the Gospels, some very strong arguments have been made that nowhere does Jesus actually call himself God. He uses all this other language. He calls himself the Son of Man over and over. Every time someone else wants to call him, what's the other phrase? There's other phrases that would connect him to being God. His preferred phrase was, "I'm the Son of Man," which has been interpreted in different ways. But very smart, much smarter people than I have who study the Greek, who study that, have made very good arguments that Jesus never actually calls himself God. So like today, like in like fundamentalist Christian, churches, like I grew up hearing that Jesus called himself basically called himself the Son of God, and he never actually calls himself the Son of God. You get, you have these Gospels, these stories told about his life that are insinuating all these things, and they're literary. They're bringing in all this cultural understandings, allusions, references, political references to basically tell a story about who this person was to them. So the stories that we have about him are already being filtered through their understanding. And some really good work has been done by this one scholar. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's been drawing out all of the allusions and references to like the Odyssey and the Iliad and like classical Greek literature, showing all these like references and allusions to classical Greek literature. So even in like Mark and in these Gospels, they're using all this language to basically say something about this person to their culture, and knowingly doing it. Really good arguments have been made showing that that's the case. And then a lot of other really good work has been done to, scholars of Roman society and politics and culture, and going back to the Gospels and looking at all of these political references that are being made. So the Son of God phrase was a Roman phrase that was used for Caesar. That's what they called Caesar, was the Son of God. And there's all these different phrases that are used throughout the Gospels that are usually referred to Caesar. And so you have these Christians calling Jesus all these things, which is saying, which are basically political statements. You guys have your Caesar, but this is who we are going to follow, worship, be led by, follow, all this stuff. And so the the Gospels as stories, as statements, are highly political, that are directly referencing the politics and the culture of their time. They're deeply literary. They're referencing the literature of their time, because that literature is all about the gods of that time. And so you have these early Christians making statements against Caesar and the politics of the time, and making statements in direct contrast to the religion and way of life and culture and gods of that time. So yes, you're right. Like, it would be deeply problematic for Jesus to call himself God. But some people recently have shown that he never actually did so. But again, the stories that we have are from the followers of that person, Jesus. So, none of the Gospels were written by Jesus. So I think it's highly likely that he never actually would have ever called himself God. And I think that it would have been problematic for him to do so. But like any movement, the followers kind of insert themselves into the story, and what we know today is deeply influenced by them. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, I have one other follow-up question to that. One of the things I thought was strange too is the names of his disciples. Like, where do these names come from? Because they're obviously not of Hebrew origin.
Right.
They don't seem to be. And there is a category of names considered Christian, and I'm kind of wondering where these names come from. Were these made up for the Bible, or did these names predate the Bible at some point?
I will begin by saying that I am not a Greek expert at all. My Greek is terrible. And I am also not a biblical scholar at all. Like, what I know is from going to, getting a bachelor's in like religion, but it was a very, very practical stuff. So I'm not gonna be able to answer in any satisfactory way, like a lot of questions like that. I believe disciple and rabbi are coming from the Greek translations. I'm trying to remember the Hebrew. I had it all memorized, but now I'm starting to forget. But yeah, there are Hebrew words. I could do a quick search. Look up the Hebrew for disciple, because that.
Yeah, because I always had trouble looking up the etymology for some of the names of the disciples, like Paul and Mark, and
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, where do these names come from? Because they don't exactly.
Hey, real quick, I do know that my buddy who's on my podcast, who's the Messianic Jew, that they don't even say Jesus in Hebrew; it's Yeshua. So
yeah, it's Yeshua. It's actually Joshua. The name that we have today, Joshua, is Jesus. Like Jesus' name was, Yeshua or Joshua.
There's a lot of translation issues, I'm sure, with the original names with all of them.
Don't some of the names change once people so to speak find God and whatnot, like Saul and Paul and Abram and Abraham and whatnot? I guess those aren't the disciples, though. Obviously, well, maybe Paul would be.
What was Peter's name?
Simon. Oh shoot.
Yeah, Peter's name got changed. A lot of their names got changed, and I don't understand why. I think some of it, like Peter's name got changed from Cephas. Cephas. His name was Cephas. That was his Roman name. From that? And then Peter got changed. It got changed to Peter, and it means rock. So a lot of their names, I think, gets changed for literary reasons or religious reasons. It's always symbolic of something else. So I know that a lot of symbolism is going on as well. And I think that that's something important for and that's something that a lot of people are trying to show to more fundamentalist believers, is that there is so much political reference, so much literary reference, so much symbolism, so much all of these different genre specific factors going into the Bible, going into the Gospels, that to just read it in the plain King James English and say, this is the inspired word of God, this is the truth, is highly problematic. It's really hard to actually know what any of the scripture is saying. On one level, some of it is clear, but most of it is not. If you don't understand at all what's going on in the culture of the time, the language, the references, you're not going to walk away with, understanding fully what is even being said. That is usually what begins the kind of deconstruction process for a lot of fundamentalist Christians that I know, is they have this understanding from their upbringing and what they're raised to believe, and they have this very deep devotional life to the Bible. They read it every day. This was how I lived, how I was raised. I read the Bible every day. And just subjectively thinking that I'm understanding more and more and more, and then start reading books about it, or you go to Bible college and they just kind of knock down all of your preconceptions, and you're kind of left there standing oh shit, how, what do I do with this? Everything that I thought and believed is being proved problematic, and I don't even know if I can understand anything just directly reading the Bible myself. If I don't have 5 commentaries in front of me, I don't know if I can understand anything. That's a very, very common thing for Christians to go through when they are starting to research this stuff. So the Bible is problematic. It's not easy. You can't just read it in one sitting and be got it. You might be able to understand some of the narrative, because a lot of the Bible is written in narrative form, or the book of Job very much probably was an actual play. It has the play structure of that time. That was a very thematic book itself. So some of the narrative can be understood, but as far as the wisdom literature and understanding the Gospels, which are highly political books, and every single letter and every single book in the Bible was written for a reason. A lot of the letters, if not all the letters in the New Testament, were written and circulated because there was a problem in the church. And so you had this problem that was starting to create trouble within the church. And during that time, you needed to stay as unified as possible. So you had Peter or Paul, mostly Paul, or all these different, New Testament authors writing to answer the questions. And we don't have access to those questions other than what is in the letters. We don't have access to the problems other than what is stated in the letter. But it's imagine owning a business and your business is starting to fall apart because you have one part of your business, one department feuding with another department. And so you have all this shit going on. Maybe one side is Hillary supporters and one side is Trump supporters. And so you have this huge political fight going on. And you, as the CEO, you have to pretty much calm the sea. You have to put this fire out. So you write this huge long memo to everyone to kind of, you know, solve the problem and make everyone come back together and not care about, you know, their political differences and, you know, get back to working together as a united front. That's what a lot of these letters in the New Testament is the CEO writing to, you know, a group of people in the same church or the same couple of churches to kind of put out the fires. And we don't have access to the problem that started, you know, the thing that started the problem, but we have their response to the problem. I'm pretty sure almost every single one of the letters are letters to specific concrete problems that were going on in a church. And we have little references, like names are used sometimes, like, you know, so-and-so and so-and-so and how great they are. Be like them in this issue. And we have no idea what the issue is, but we just have these references that we have to make. So all these things, all these, you know, weird things, that all this contextualization we have to do, you know, to read these statements, to read these letters, and you know, the Bible in general.
I have another weird question, and this is just a story that has puzzled me in the Bible. I don't know if it's something that you had researched through your education or anything, but there's a story that Rogan brings up all the time about a bald dude getting made fun of and then calling on God to sick bears on him. Like, is there any type of cultural reference or any insight that doesn't make it seem like super ridiculous?
No, it is probably going to sound super ridiculous no matter what.
It's mythic.
Yeah, it's basically a story of don't mess with the man of God or the prophet. I think it was Ezekiel.
It was Elijah.
It was Elijah?
Elijah or Elisha and the she-bears, yeah.
And the she-bears? Yeah. He was a prophet, and, you know, he was a big deal during that time. He was one of the main prophets.
Fire coming down from heaven, all that stuff.
I think it was Elijah. Like, just previously, the same prophet, like, had a showdown with the gods of Baal or Baal. Like, he had, like, a cosmic showdown with a group of people that believed in another god. And
so it's like the Infinity Gauntlet.
Yes, just like that.
Not kidding.
But he called down fire and basically destroyed all these people, proving that his god was the biggest badass. And I think that story is just kind of following that theme of don't mess with the man of God, because he's, you know, he's speaking the words of God. So there is a lot of that nonsense in the Old Testament, and a little bit in the New Testament. In Acts, you have a little bit of that. There was this couple that were in the early church, and they were lying about the amount of money they had, because they were all giving money. You know, they basically had a little communist, you know, thing going on. They were all putting in all their money into the pot, and then it would be dispersed. And they were lying about it. And then I think they fell off like a tall.
Peter? Well, no, one of them struck down dead immediately.
Oh yeah, one of them struck dead.
She came in later.
They both died, though. I think it is kind of within that. You know, there's a lot of that, unfortunately. But no, it's always going to sound, you know, stupid.
A few chapters later, that guy teleported.
Yeah.
Starting to sound a lot like a comic book.
Yeah.
For sure,
Yeah.
100%. And if you come to it with that understanding, you might actually understand it better than a lot of people do.
Well, do they have Bible comic books that make like a graphic novel out of the Bible? That would be pretty amazing.
Unfortunately.
No, there's a actual guy who worked for Marvel for a long, long time who illustrated it and wrote a pretty good one. I'll get the name for it in a little bit for you guys.
Hey, come on! Don't you guys know Chick Tracks?
That's no good. We're it's very, very biblically inaccurate.
Hayden, when you were answering Dusty's first question there, were you saying that the term Son of God was more of a political interpretation?
Yeah, that's what they called Caesar.
Yep.
I'm confused by that.
Because his father was God.
So he was
on the
as
money.
the emperor, he was like on par with the gods. He was, seen as a deity. And so that was a phrase used. Like if you were to look at old like Roman coins, it would have a picture of Caesar on it, and like above it would say like the Son of God or something like that. And there's other phrases
That's
too.
not uncommon in the historical context. I mean, Egyptians thought their leaders thought they were related to or actually gods. It's a pretty common theme in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Like they said that because they thought that Jesus should lead the Roman Empire or something like that.
He was supposed to overcome the Roman Empire. Like he was supposed to, like Jesus. His big message was the kingdom of God. He's ushering in the new kingdom of God, and basically setting all things right. Everything on earth, everything in human life is skewed, and he's gonna set it right and make everything right through his kingdom of God. So the one thing we can absolutely say about the message of Jesus was the kingdom of God. What that means, varies between, the traditions, but that really was his, what he was all about was this thing called the kingdom of God that he was ushering in, that he said, like, even now, the kingdom of God is at hand. So this kingdom, because all this stuff, religion, culture, family life, politics, economics, everything was political, like, and religious. Like back then, everything was interconnected. Your economics, if to think economically was to think religiously, which was to think politically, which was to think, like, everything was connected. So if you make a statement about one kind of, like, if I was to make a statement about how I want to spend my money, that's automatically a statement about how I worship God, because the entire religious system was wrapped up in your economic system. Like people were constantly giving sacrifices. There were all these rituals behind, before I can go to work, I have to go to this temple. Before, even the Jews, before, I don't know, I think it might have actually been a joke, but I think that there's an actual going to bathroom prayer. Like,
oh, that's true.
Yeah. It's like, so like all this stuff, like everything is like all completely intertwined. So all these statements about Jesus are just by their nature political, economic. Jesus directly talked about money a lot. So in his whole kingdom message, he is describing how we should relate to each other economically, how we should relate to each other politically, how we should relate to each other in our families, how we should relate to ourselves, and all these different things. All these things are intermixed. So yeah, every time he made a statement, or made a statement in these stories by the disciples, in their gospels, they're making statements about Rome and about Caesar and about all these different things.
Okay. It was a very flipped way of seeing things from what this like Western way of thought that had come in with the Roman Empire, where he's saying things like, as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me, where in Roman culture it would have been, as you do it to the highest, you do it unto Caesar.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So he's like criticizing the hierarchy in a sense too.
Yes,
very real sense.
Completely.
That's the kingdom of God in a huge way.
Yeah.
In terms of the history of Jesus, I wonder if anyone else has read Reza Aslan's book called Zealot, because I found that really interesting when I read it. If I remember correctly, the people have criticized it and said that it's not that historically accurate, but I found it interesting because it if I remember correctly, he writes about this idea about how Jesus was perhaps more of like a radical revolutionary and even perhaps a violent revolutionary than the common conception of him.
Yeah, that's one of the hypotheses. So like you have like several hypotheses about like who Jesus was. That the revolutionary one is a really, really popular one. And then there's several others that I can't like remember to go through all of them, but that's like it's a really strong hypothesis, which I think is like definitely part of the picture. I think that there was several things going on, but like I was saying, like with all these things intertwined, all these things to speak religiously is to speak politically. To speak about the way we should relate to God is to speak revolutionarily about, politics. So to say that, to love God is to love your neighbor as yourself is to put your neighbor ahead of not only you, but Caesar.
Yeah.
And so, you're supposed to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but in this situation, to give to God means directly to give to your neighbor, to give to the least of these, to give, so he is making revolutionary statements and claims and all that at the same time as, this religious kingdom language,
You mentioned Martin Luther, and I think it's interesting what you were just saying made me think about kind of like parallels between Jesus and Martin Luther, like how Jesus was dangerous because he was challenging the Roman Empire, who was controlling the world in a sense at the time. And then Martin Luther was, in a sense, challenging the Christian church at the time and the way they were operating. And he was essential in allowing the common person to read books, which was a revolutionary historical event, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and he was doing a lot of things. I think the main, like, what, 93 thesis, 95 thesis that he, mythically, as the story goes, nailed on the door of the church or whatever. Like that paper he wrote was about the church and their practice of indulgences. So basically, at that time, the church had put in this belief structure where, at that time they had come up with purgatory at this point. And, if you weren't good enough to go to heaven yet, but not bad enough to go to hell, you were put in purgatory. And the people that were still alive today could do what are called indulgences, which is money going to the church in order to help get their family into heaven. So this became a huge practice. And Martin Luther was basically, he was a bit of a scholar, and he basically wrote against that practice, which he was going against, the church and the people in charge and the Pope. And he actually he never tried to start a revolution. He never tried to go against like Christianity as such, or like the church as such. He was just trying to change this one practice. And it was really normal for people to like they're basically, putting their master thesis, at the town square, and they would kind of, discuss, but no one would like discuss this thing with him. So he was like, well, fuck it, I'm going to nail this thing here. And, people read it, got really mad, tried to shut him up. And he's like, no, like, I think I'm right. So, like Lutheranism kind of started, years later after all this, but he never tried to stop being a Catholic. Like in his heart of hearts, he was a Catholic. He was just against the Pope after like all the politics that went into all of that stuff. But yeah, the story of Luther is really interesting. And also the fact that he was a heretic.
Didn't the term Catholic not come about until after Martin Luther? Or am I wrong about that?
I think you're wrong about that,
Catholic
but I guess
universal.
I don't know.
It was in the creed.
Yeah, no, the Catholic was used before that. It means universal, the universal church, like the one church.
Okay.
Because at
When
that
did
time,
it
it
come
basically
about?
was.
That's little Catholic, not big C Catholic. Though there's a difference.
Okay. You talking to me or Andrew?
Just a general comment. Just the difference between Catholic as the universal church and Catholic as the known religion are two different. Coming from the Restoration churches, trying to restore back to that unified, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was a tangent.
I like that.
I apologize.
No, thanks for the clarification.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting too that until Martin Luther, priests would face the front of the church with their backs to the congregation, and they would read the Bible in Latin, and people had no fucking idea what they were saying. And I think another interesting thing that I learned about Martin Luther more recently is that I kind of had this idea since he, like with Protestantism, that there were like more progressive interpretations of Christianity, but that Martin Luther actually had like really like traditional and more conservative interpretations of Christianity.
Yeah, he was, he was a conservative. He was also like dealing with his own personal shit. He had a bad relationship with his father and had like all this depression. Like his big question with, what he's famous for other than like the Reformation in general was, how do I know that I'm saved? So he had all of this like death anxiety wrapped up with hell anxiety, wrapped up with all, daddy issues. And his whole thing was like, how can I know that I'm good? Like, how do I know that I am saved, that I'm going to go to heaven? Is it from my works? Is it from, reading the Bible and going to church and all this stuff? Or is it, he joined like the mystic monks for a little bit, where their whole thing was about love. Like you just have to love God and God is love and all this stuff. And he joined them for a little bit and then he wasn't satisfied with that either. He's like, no, this is super fucking subjective. Like, how do I need to know? And so he went to the Bible and he really latched on to Paul's writings about grace. You are saved by grace and faith alone, not by works. And so he latched onto that. And so he's really famous for the grace, thing that
the solas.
Yeah, that became really big in like, the Protestant traditions, like you're saved by grace, not by works. So like Protestants from there on throughout the years have, like I grew up, which I'm a whole different thing, Protestant, and then the Pentecostals branched off from that. But we always viewed these like mainline traditions, so like Catholicism and like, yes, mostly Catholicism, and being like, oh, like your whole thing is about works, going to church and doing all these, rituals, and you have to do it because it's part of the mass, and you have to do the mass in order to maintain your like salvation. Like that's what we were, led to think. And so like they're worshiping God or relating to God through works. They have to work for their salvation. And we were coming from, the line of Luther that was all about grace. You're saved by grace and faith alone. You have to believe. And so earlier when I said that whole, our modern notion of belief is very, relatively modern, the last like 300-400 years, I think a strong argument could be made that it's linked to Luther and his writings and what he did, this idea of you're saved by faith and grace alone. And so this idea of faith, how are you saved by faith? What is faith? What is that doing metaphysically when you have faith? Like how is that saving you? So you have like all this theological understanding about faith and belief, branching out of that, which went on to influence the psychology of that time. Like before psychology was a science like it is today, it was a philosophy. And before it was a philosophy, psychology was a theology. And so all like what we understand about psychology, all branches, all roads lead to Luther when it comes to like our understanding, like the religious understanding of belief and faith is very different from how we would normally like talk about it.
And the grace doctrine.
Sorry, go ahead.
The grace doctrine is really a religious game changer, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Within all religions, I mean, there's usually some sort of payment for your salvation or something that you have to do, and it really takes that all out of your hands and makes you realize that, or makes the point that it's not about you. It's about
works.
Or, it's not about that kind of stuff anymore. And that's really a new idea for religions in of the world. I mean, it's just that nobody else had played that game before, and so I think that's an interesting twist where Christianity takes a change.
Yeah,
sure.
Because before that, you had to do things in order to gain the love and the salvation of God. There were rituals, there were practices, you had to give your money to the sacrifices.
When you could never give enough, or sacrifice.
You can never give them up.
More next time.
So it was a game changer. But if you were to read Nietzsche, it wasn't a good game changer. Nietzsche liked those works.
Two questions. What were Martin Luther's daddy issues? And also, what are the other specifics of Pentecostalism in comparison to other doctrines?
So it's been a long time since I've read on Luther's biography. I can't remember. He just had daddy issues. He wasn't close with his father at all. I can't remember specifically, but it is interesting reading about. As far as Pentecostalism, so after the Reformation, you have Protestantism split from Catholicism, and then you have like all these different sects. So after Lutheranism, you have Calvinism, and then you have like the Puritans later on. You have all these Protestant, mostly, like the Baptist tradition is branched off from this Reformed tradition that goes to like John Calvin, and like all those reformers. And then you have all these different traditions. Well, one of those traditions is like the Church of England, which are the Anglicans. They branch off through some, very fun history. Yeah, some Pope history and King history and lots of fun stuff. But you have the Church of England split off, and out of Anglicanism, you have the Wesleys, and so you have this guy named John Wesley who was raised up in the Anglican Church, and he ends up having a religious experience himself. And so I don't have all the details straight in my head, but I know at some point he starts, this holiness movement, or it might have started without him, but he was a big part of it. But this holiness movement started, I think,
late 1700s.
Late 1700s, I think, in America. He brought it over, right?
And that turned into the Methodist.
Yeah, and it turned into
the 1800s.
Yeah, and then it turned into Methodism. So, like, the Methodist Church branches from John Wesley, which is a very like holiness movement, very much like about the feeling of your relationship with God. They had a lot
also
of
that there was a method to get to these ecstatic experiences,
right.
Which those really were a cornerstone of Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
What became Pentecostalism.
So you had these practices that you did, a method to have these religious experiences, which could be described, just read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. You have all these people like connecting with this ineffable spiritual world and, these ecstatic experiences and all this different stuff, feeling one with the universe, very close to like the mystics. So you have this holiness movement, and then you have like the Methodist movement, and all, there's all these revivals going on. And then you get to the early 1900s, and there was a group of people that were within that tradition out of, that branched out of John Wesley and the holiness movement. And they all got together. I don't remember if they had a name. I think
it was just a Bible school. It was a small Bible school.
Yeah, of people that were really into these like experiences. They got together, and there was like some revival that happened. People started speaking in tongues, which wasn't a thing over the last 2,000 years. That wasn't a thing at all until early 1900s, late 1800s in America.
Monks were doing it.
Were they?
Yeah.
There are different things called
fathers.
Glossolalia is the technical term, but you have these people who, out of this revival start speaking in tongues, and they're like, oh, like, let's go back to the Bible. And you have Pentecost happen in Acts, and they're like, we are now connected to the very first original church, which is a theme with all of these traditions, is they all think they're doing it the way that the original church did.
Yeah.
So you have these,
you can see that in politics and any type of idea at all. Everyone thinks that they have the true form of this ideology.
So they connect this experience that they all had with the Pentecost in Acts, in the book of Acts, this thing called Pentecost, where they're all speaking different languages and speaking in tongues. And that became a huge thing in their tradition. And so that I came out of the Assemblies of God church, which began in
1914.
1914. I think it was 14. But so it's a really, it's 100-year-old tradition of speaking in tongues and feeling the fire of God, and very ecstatic, very subjective feeling, kind of centered religion, Christianity, which has gone in so many crazy directions. You have the snake handlers in the mountains, and you have
now in a lot of ways it was a product of its time, If you look at what was popular when it started, abolition. And so that's still kind of a thing with it. And then also rapture theology was popular in that time. And that's also still one of kind of a distinct, it's actually one of the pillars. In the Assembly of God, there's 16 fundamental truths. You can look them up. Most of them aren't that different from most churches, but the rapture is one of them. And Jesus is God wasn't one until 30 years later. They had to add it. They forgot.
But speaking about like the times is really important, because when like the Pentecostal people came out of this time, so between 1850 and early 1900s is a time where Charles Darwin is now becoming a household name of like the academic circles. You have the Civil War, which completely destroys everyone's sense of like humanity and what it means to be an American, and it destroys their like really optimistic identity. So you have this period of time where identity, what it means to be a human, what it means to, be a person in America, like all those things are starting to be shot. And in religion and in Christianity, with all this new science that's coming out, you have this idea of evolution, and basically you get all the foundations that people were able to rely on forever are all crumbling down. So you have this foundationalist time where people are kind of grasping for straws. And so that fact, I think it's been called the crisis of the Gilded Age, this period of time where there's no foundations, everything's contingent, everything is just like everyone's kind of grasping for straws. You have, all these really interesting people, writing during this time. You have Nietzsche, you have William James, you have like all these people, coming, Leo Tolstoy. Like it was a time of lots of depression, lots of anxiety, and people were kind of reaching in their respective fields to kind of figure out, where do we go from here? Well, in religion, where do you go from here? You had the Universalists, which were kind of like the really like they were very much connected to like natural design, intelligent design arguments for God, like very connected with science, because the previous science was very Newtonian. So everything was like clockwork. God made everything the way it's supposed to be and work exactly how it's supposed to work. And then, Darwin comes along and shows things aren't perfect and neat like clockwork. Things are messy. Things are wasteful. Like the way that the world is made is very, very messy and wasteful. And so like in religion, that kind of got shot. And so you have all these traditions that are not having all this science and all this anxiety and contingency. And they are asking the question, how do I know that God is there? How do I know that I am saved? How do I know that I am good with God? And so all these people during this time, they decided, how do I know? Well, it's a felt experience. I feel God. So me feeling God equals me knowing God. Me experiencing God, or this spiritual Pentecostal experience, that is how I know. So our subjectivity and what we feel becomes linked with our epistemology and how we know that we are saved. Going back to, Luther, like, how do I know I'm saved? I'm saved by faith. I'm saved by grace. Well, how do I know that I'm saved by faith and grace? Like, how do I know? Well, you have, with the Methodists and the holiness movement, I know because I have these experiences, and there's a method to these experiences. And then the Pentecostals, and then, where I came from, the Assemblies of God, how do I know that I am saved by faith and grace? And how do I know that I am connected with God? And how do I know that I had an experience with God? They decided that how you know is through speaking in tongues. So speaking in tongues became the epistemology for, that experience with God. How do I know that I had an experience with God? Because it leads to speaking in tongues and the gifts of the Spirit and all these different things, like doing miracles and speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues and all these different things that, can be linked to, some statements in the New Testament. So, like I was saying in the intro to this entire discussion, Christianity is a 2,000-year-old tradition of disagreement, of arguments, of existential questions, and angst and anxiety, and all these things. All these people asking, who is God? What does it mean to be in relationship with God? And how do I know that I am in that relationship with God? So the history of Christianity is asking those questions. And there's lots of disagreement on those things. And everyone kind of figures out their own special way to know those things and to know that they're good with God. So it's very much a tradition, which seems a little disrespectful, but you're grasping for something to be your foundation, which is really interesting to discuss now because I would argue that we, in the last 100 years since Darwin, we have continued to live in a contingent, foundationalist, groundless world, and all of our religions, traditions, even cultural understanding, science, politics, everything's been existentially, anxiously grasping for a way to put a foundation in place, because deep down we know there are no foundations. So I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I really appreciate about your podcast is learning about all the different ways that there are to be Christian. And that I liked how you summed up the history of how we got to like a more modern Western conception of religion, and how you were talking about how everyone's belief in whatever religion or lack thereof they have is deeply personal and based on their individual psychology, which is why saying that someone belongs to a particular religion doesn't necessarily mean that they follow any particular doctrine.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, religion's really, really personal. Even when it's super communal and everyone is agreeing on the same set of doctrines and beliefs, like it still is really personal, like Martin Luther, like things were pretty much figured out, as far as Christian doctrine by the time he came along, and he still had this existential crisis, with his own understanding of what it meant to relate to God and to be a human, and what does it mean to be saved. He had a very personal crisis that he needed to find answers to. And I would argue that the history of Christianity is people having those personal crises and trying to find answers. Earlier I said, like, the job of a theologian is to ask all those questions that I just mentioned with the language and the understanding of the technology and the culture of their time. Because we always need new definitions for who is God, because what it means to be God, or what does it mean to relate to God, in ancient Greek times is different than a little later on. And, as we go in every generation, every culture, like we need new ways of describing this thing that is really subjective, whether there is a real God or not. That might be an interesting topic of conversation. Like, what do we mean by God? But I'll open it up to any questions or any other topics that people want to describe.
Yeah, I had a question regarding different sects of Christianity. What is the largest sect? Is it Catholicism?
I think it's still Catholicism.
It is Catholicism.
But Pentecostalism is the fastest growing.
Well, Assembly of God is the
only
growing.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, people are leaving in droves.
Yeah.
And
another follow-up to that, do you think that's the case because of the hierarchical system within the Catholic Church? Like, is there in the other churches, is there any Pope-like figure in their other sects of worship?
There's usually a head guy. Like I'll speak from
Not a Pope-like figure. We're not gonna go that far.
but like a head dude. Like in the Assemblies of God that I was raised with. It's very like kind of like American government structure. Like we have, are they called bishops?
There's a bishop.
There's regional guys, and then we have one guy for every state who's kind of overseeing the state, and then we have
Presbyter.
presbyter, and then we have the main guy of like the entire tradition, who is the general superintendent, and he's kind of like the the president. I'm pretty sure every other at least the ones that I know all have a similar structure where there's it's kind of a government in place.
And the head of the synod.
Yeah, so most of them have that, but none of the Pentecost or none of the Protestant traditions have anything like a pope, because that was their whole thing. They were breaking away from that kind of authority structure. So they went from the Pope is the voice of God to the Bible is the voice of God. So the authority for Protestants is the Bible, which is why we have so many Protestant sects. That's why we have so many denominations, because they said, no, the authority is the Bible. Okay, let's all read the Bible. We all disagree on what this thing is saying, and then they all broke off into hundreds and probably thousands of different denominations. So that's their baggage, But yeah, most of them have what?
I was going to say the Mormons aren't normally considered a Protestant church; they're considered other. And as a restorationist church, the head Mormon is actually called the Prophet, and it's he's supported by the quorum of the 12 apostles, and 2 counselors to him, and so we used to joke that Catholics and Mormons have stated doctrines about their head guy and then actually observe precisely the opposite thing. Mormons have no official status of infallibility of the head of the church, but they all act as if he is.
Yeah, that's really common.
Yeah, the Pope actually does. There is a doctrine of infallibility of the Pope, and very few Catholics actually believe it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I was talking with Alex Bello about that recently, about how a lot of Catholics say that they follow these particular rules, but they just kind of like lie about it and just like follow their own personal interpretation of them instead. Like if like she said, for example, that if you when you get married, a lot of Catholics, they still have to say that they'll raise their children in the Christian tradition, but they won't necessarily actually do that.
Yeah. Well, I think Catholicism has been around for so long that a lot of it, I wasn't raised in that, so I can't speak, too authoritatively about it. But, a lot of Catholicism has been around for so long that it's similar to Judaism, where there's a lot of cultural Catholics. And I think that that's starting to happen with Christianity in general. There's a lot of cultural Protestants, like me and Drew and my friend Chris Johnson, who joined the group. He hasn't spoken yet, but there you are. Like we were all very, we were all very involved in ministry, and like all of our friends were very, very involved in the church and with ministry. And we would, get together and talk about like, why do people, why are there all these cultural Christians in our church? We were in like the Pentecostal church. So like in every group you're going to have, I think, and especially in like modern times, and I'm sure it's been the case always, you'll have like cultural Christians, cultural, maybe even cultural Mormons, cultural Catholics, cultural Jewish people, like people that go, it is part of your group identity, which is a very deep evolutionary thing in all of our being. You want to belong to the group. and it's very similar to group dynamics in politics, in in CrossFit, in all these different things. Like like maybe there's people in CrossFit that are like, I don't think this is actually the healthiest way to do this, guys, but I'm not going to say anything because this is my this is my group. These are my people.
I pledge to raise my children.
So yeah, just psychology.
CrossFit is the way, blasphemer.
We will raise our children in CrossFit.
Yes. So many more jokes are coming to mind, but the evolutionary psychology of religion is very, very interesting, and we can never get away from it. We have all these psychological things that will always be at play, and I would argue have always been at play with everything that we've been talking about today. But yeah, does anyone else have anything they want to talk about?
Well, in relation to what you just said, it would be interesting to talk about Jordan Peterson in terms of the psychological importance of religion, or what he says about the psychological importance of religious interpretations.
Yeah, we could talk about Jordan Peterson, but maybe as a intro to that conversation, what is interesting about Jordan Peterson is that like people call him a Christian. He says that that's, not quite true. I think it could also be accurate to describe him like colloquially as an atheist. Like, I don't think he was a Christian like recently. I think that that's something that he like describes, very, very in very, complex ways. But apart from, his whole way of thinking and believing, it's interesting that in the last 5 or so years, Christianity in the broader culture has really been being saved by atheists and atheist scientists. People that we may all know: Jonathan Haidt, Joe Henrich, Jordan Peterson, a guy that I mentioned earlier, Andrew Newberg, who's the neuroscientist on belief. Andrew is a Jewish atheist. I think John Haidt and Joe Henrich are both atheists. I don't know, if there's any caveats to that. Jordan Peterson, I would probably describe as an atheist, besides, how he describes himself as a qualified Christian. He says he lives.
You would describe him as more of an atheist than like a pragmatic Christian, kind of more like you?
Well, he's very much, I don't know. I don't know the guy. I certainly would not, I'm not going to say anything beyond what he has described, but he is a naturalist. He is, but he is a pragmatist. That's a whole separate thing that he's looking at his naturalism and materialism through. But he is very much a materialist, naturalist, evolutionary thinker, scientist. But he also, much like me and my pragmatic Christianity, realizes that religious belief is just as natural as, any materialism. Like, religious belief has been part of humanity since the dawn of time, as far as we know. So it's very ingrained in us. We can speculate about why that is, and we can talk about evolution and the pressures that have led to such things.
Didn't he say in his new book, 12 Rules for Life, that there are no atheists?
Yeah, which is another like tongue-in-cheek way of saying like we all believe in things beyond ourselves. We all, point to, authority structures beyond ourselves. Like, we all act religiously, something. We all worship something. We all put our full attention to something. Paul Tillich, who was a theologian, he described faith as ultimate concern. So we all have ultimate concern somewhere, whether our ultimate concern is with our parents and our relationship with our parents follows us the rest of our life, whether they're alive or dead, or our ultimate concern is on money or self-worth or our body image or God or, whatever it is. We all have ultimate concern somewhere. And when you don't have an ultimate concern, when you don't have that, that highest value in the hierarchy of values, you can experience great anxiety and depression. And, earlier when I was talking about the crisis of the Gilded Age, in that period of time where in the, 1850s to 1900s, where everything, like all their grounds, all their foundations were crumbling, human beings don't do well living like that. It's very difficult
I
to
disagree.
You can disagree. But yeah, so I don't know what Jordan Peterson is, but it is interesting that Jordan Peterson aside, I would say that in the broader culture, Christianity is being saved by atheists because the Christians themselves have done a piss poor job at it. People laugh at them, but you have all these atheist scientists pretty much saving the image of Christianity or talking about the value of religion in general, which I think is very interesting.
That's interesting too, because I hear a lot of people say that Jordan Peterson is just preaching for like old-fashioned traditional conservative views, yet he has said before that he doesn't even go to church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't gone to church in like 2 years.
I haven't gone to church since this morning.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm trying to work out, through my podcast and with my writings, which hopefully I'll start posting on the website. But something that I'm trying to work out is how can we do religion? How can we relate to God? How can we identify as Christian today in a time where, besides the Assemblies of God, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the nuns, non-affiliated people are the fastest growing, religious identity, all these people who are all for spirituality or religion or belief or some kind of relationship with a higher power, but want nothing to do with the church. The church as an institution has done such a poor job just by the virtue of being a human institution, like any other human institution has done, such a poor job at, especially in modern times, that people don't want to go to institutional church anymore. People are leaving the church in general more and more and more. So the question that I'm working through,
all unite, is through mixed mental arts and the Callan faith.
The Church of Mixed Mental Arts, the Church of Brian Callan,
the Callan faith.
But I'm trying to work out. What's that?
I was going to ask, do you think the reason that people don't go to institutional churches or that's falling off because of the rise of people moving into cities?
Interesting.
I'm reaching back to something that I read related to that, but it's a long journey and I'm not sure if I'll get there.
In our experience and what our congregation has dealt with, the thing we're wrestling with right now that speaks to that seems to be that the way that social justice has gone, Christianity has become immoral to culture when before it used to be the morality to culture, in a sense. And so that is something we've been wrestling with. And I know in the city, I am in the city of Detroit, the city center, not Metro Detroit. I am in the city of Detroit. Most of the people that I actually know my age in the city of Detroit don't go to church because Christianity is become immoral in their sense of social justice and morality and things that we see on TV and in media and that are said.
And I think,
so do you think Detroit that's kind of a generational thing in a sense?
Probably. I mean, generational factors always play in. I think Detroit is a little bit of a unique thing just with where it is right now. But I think in general, relating to Dustin's question, I think that the main factor playing into to your question is pluralism. So in cities, you have more different kinds of people all in a very small space than anywhere else. And so you have exposure to not only all these different kinds of Christians, but all these different kinds of religious people, all these different kinds of atheists, and atheists that are spiritual, and spiritual people that are atheists, and Christians that are also atheists. Like, that is an actual thing. Is there are Christian atheists. They call themselves well, it's called like pyrotheology. They burn down the theology and their images of God, but they say they don't believe in God, but they are still Christians. They still identify as Christians. So it's like you have just the whole gamut of, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of varieties of believing and not believing and kind of believing and not believing at the same time. You have all these varieties of things. And in cities specifically, you have all of that very concentrated in one area. So I think that is very likely that, you know, that kind of dynamic is related to like the decline of people going to church. But I think it's something that's going on everywhere. I mean, we live in the age of the internet, and we have exposure to all that plurality at the touch of our fingers. And I think, you know, we can go to other countries in our offices. You know, we can see how other people live. We're very, very hyper connected in a way that we never were before. You know, even 100 years ago, you may never have left your town. So our exposure to other skin tones, our exposure to other cultures, our exposure to other languages and all of these different religions and different things, I think is definitely playing a part in people realizing that, you know, the guy that's standing up and speaking at our church, he says that he has the authority of God and can lead us to the one true way. But you have all these other guys saying the exact same thing about other things, and they're all kind of living the same. So I think that we live in a very unique time where these questions are going to have to be, you know, they're going to have to be asked in unique ways and answered in unique ways. So
I also think that there is a little bit of what you were saying, or I'm sorry, I know your guys' name very well, the guy on the left, about Drew. About the cultural climate. And I think that when, you know, for years or whatever, we've been saying that you know, we follow a God of love and grace, and then they look over and they see what, you know, sounds like hate speech, or sounds like, you know, you got to follow all these rules, you got to do this, you got to do that. You know, if you're gay, you're going to hell. If you're this, you're doing, you know, and that just those two things don't jive. And so when you're trying to make a case for something that people are just looking at like, it just looks like complete hypocrisy. And so, and that's disingenuous. And why would, so I mean, that I think it distance people faster than the different opinions or this or that. The other thing is just Christians are Christians' own worst enemies. If you go out and you do something in front of somebody, they're like, "Oh, I thought you were a Christian," or that, you know, that problem that we have, or that Christianity has in our current culture.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, and I think that reminds me of how like people like me and Dusty, for example, became militant atheists, probably at least in part because we had this kind of misinterpretation in a sense that religion means authority. So being an atheist means you're anti-authoritarian, but that's really like an oversimplification.
Yeah, religion has meant different things to different people throughout time. And someone made a comment about how difficult it is for people to conceptualize religion. Like there has been, since, you know, any kind of science or like philosophical discussion of what is religion began, people have never been able to land on a definition. Even the best, clearest thinking scientists today, sociologists, anthropologists, they cannot come up with a definition of religion. It's easy for us to, but when you actually sit down and start to write out all the functions of religion, what it does, has done, the way it bonds people, the way it unites people, the way it does, like just a whole list of things. And it does different things in different contexts for different people in different places and times. It's very, very, very difficult to actually come up with a definition of religion, to the point where in like William James's Varieties of the Religious Experience, he just says, he's like, I'm going to just kind of forget all of that. He's like, let's not even get into a conversation about what religion is specifically. I'm just going to talk about one specific thing about religion, which is religious experience, which is like the wisest thing he could have done, because otherwise it would have been like a 5-volume book just on trying to describe what the hell religion is. So it's a very difficult thing to pin down, even though, you know, it's kind of like that judge or whoever it was.
Pornography.
About, like, exactly. I know it when I see it. And that's kind of how it is with religion. Like we all understand what it means, but we can't all describe it in a perfect way that generalizes to every circumstance.
So a thought on that, in our work in the innovation company that I work in, we often do this mental exercise of, imagine this thing that we're talking about now that's really well known and everything had never existed. And someone just came up for the idea of it right now. And given today's needs, given today's reality, given cultural pressures, given, you know, socioeconomic, you know, situation, whatever, what might that look like? And I'm just wondering, I think those religions that are able to play around that way are going to be the ones that are going to survive. And kind of to that point, I guess I'd like to ask all of you if you have any opinion on, you know, thinkers like, you know, John Shelby Spong, you know, Brian McLaren, you go maybe even going out further out, Rob Bell, you know, et cetera. You know, Rob Bell wrote the book Love Wins, which essentially said, yeah, we really need to rethink hell. And, you know, mainstream Christianity essentially piled up on him and said, Rob Bell is no longer, yeah, he's no longer a pastor. Beware of him and all that. So I see, you know, John Shelby Spong, I mean, just absolutely infamous.
Yeah.
He was the first Episcopalian leader to ordain a woman as a priest, the first to ordain a gay man as a priest, etc. And you know that, you know, most, if not all, denominations will eventually end up there. But anyhow, thoughts on that, on change and some of these thinkers?
Yeah.
Well, the initial question you gave, what would the world look like if religion was introduced as something new?
Yeah.
That reminds me of the movie, or I guess comic book, that it's based on, the Book of Eli.
Yeah. I like that movie a lot.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I like that movie too. I even bought like the machete. It's in my closet. But anyway,
That's awesome.
I got two.
I've got
you
that
have
Bible.
two of them.
Yeah. I started collecting machetes in different countries that I went to in South America and Central America.
That's an
So I got
awesome
one-
collector's item.
I got one from
got
Costa Rica and Nicaragua
On missions trips.
on missions trips where I was going to share the word of God to people that already know who God was, but were poor, so they weren't, you know.
Share the word of God with a machete in your hand.
Yeah, I was like, you need to know God.
No, he carried the Bible in his satchel. And the machete in the other.
Yeah, but yeah, that's what I think of it as, kind of like this powerful force that could be used for either good or evil. And I think that's how it would, like, if we didn't know religion and it came in such a sudden instance, it sounds like something people would fight over to get control of.
You mean like
And
they
they have.
do now?
Possibly.
Yeah, to get back to what you had talked about, Adam, with different thinkers, or I guess more progressive Christian thinkers like McLaren and Rob Bell. For me personally, I actually was raised like, you know, fundamentalist, evangelical, and I guess in some sense I'm still running in those circles. But I started reading Rob Bell as a teenager. Mostly because I was exposed to him in my Southern Baptist youth groups, and the way that he thought and the way that he understood Scripture and the way that I felt like he was kind of moving the needle forward was pretty incredible. And he was thoughtful in a way that I had not really considered in my lifetime. And it's funny because I actually just over the last few years have started reading Brian McLaren, and like when you read some of the stuff that he's been writing since the 90s, he's been saying all of those same things, which is really interesting to me, mostly because I think Rob Bell just says things maybe clearer, in the sense that like he doesn't use big words and it's not very intellectual, and he doesn't write super long books. He intentionally keeps them very short and to the point. And so you have like the average everyday just churchgoer. Maybe they don't really care too much about theology or what does the Bible actually say, and they'll read Rob Bell and go, "Oh my God, this guy's a heretic."
Right.
And in the meantime, like you do have John Spong and Brian McLaren that have been doing this for years, decades, and people just have never listened to what they actually write. Another example of that would be N.T. Wright. He's an Anglican bishop, and when you read his stuff, I mean, he's written entire books about heaven's not what we think heaven is, and hell's not what we think hell is, and scripture's not what we think it is, And if you actually go and read through his catalog, it's surprising to it was surprising to me when I first started to read what he was writing that it was in a sense more true to form for Christianity. But also, if the fundamentalist people that I was rubbing shoulders with would actually read it and understand it, they would probably reject it immediately. But then you'll have those same preachers and pastors. I've even encountered this where they will quote N.T. Wright or C.S. Lewis or some of these thinkers in their sermons, and then they'll go on to say something that C.S. Lewis would have never said, or that N.T. Wright would have never said. So I think something that I've realized even just recently is all religions, all different forms of religion change and modify very quickly over time. And if we actually even just look at the things that have been historically important to even just the evangelical movement, which is very new in history, the values that the evangelical movement has held have changed drastically over the last 30 years or so. And so it's interesting because you have guys that, maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago would have fallen squarely in the evangelical camp. But now because their politics are maybe a little more left or whatever it might be, they get pushed to the sidelines now. I just think that that's a very interesting thing to note.
Yeah, I think a really interesting point that you brought up, going through the different people that you were talking about, Rob Bell, N.T. Wright, John McLaren, that was the name. Brian McLaren. Like the difference between, it's like you have this Rob Bell guy who speaks really simply and also a little artistically and in a way that people can actually understand the moment they hear it. And he speaks so clearly that he is deemed a heretic, and everyone, basically pushes him out of the tradition. And, people call him, like basically say that he's, the Antichrist, bringing people away from the true God. And then you have these other authors like N.T. Wright and Brian McLaren who say very similar things, who maybe get deeper into the theology of it and stuff. And they're completely, loved by the broad church, the general church. It's like, why is Rob Bell being thrown out while these other guys are loved? Like you were saying. And there is an idea that applies in many fields, in the sciences, in philosophy, in any field you can think of, when it comes to change. And Adam, you might have some thoughts on this. When it comes to change, you can't just come into the field as a revolutionary and say, everything you guys are doing wrong, and I'm here to set you all right. The real work is done by people who have put in the time. Like all the people who are really progressive and deconstruction people who have, who people listen to today, like all these podcast hosts, Peter Enns is another scholar who comes to mind. He has put his time in. He spent 20, 30 years in the church doing scholarship, writing books, being a part of the tradition. And now is saying all these new things that people want to hear, and people are receptive to what he has to say because he's put in the time. And there's this idea of putting in the time in the sciences and philosophy and any field, that if you want to make change, if you want to push the envelope, if you want to move people forward, there's, a lot of people have to put in the time in order to have the voice. Now, at the same time, I think that the revolutionaries like Rob Bell, the people that come in, I mean, even Rob Bell put in his time. He kind of surprised people in a lot of ways. But I think it's important to have those, the new guys that really put things really clearly and really bluntly. And then the other guys that are the seasoned people that put in the time and are, a lot more conservative people are going to be a lot more receptive to them. I think there are many personalities of people out there, and a lot of people are going to, they're going to relate to the new Rob Bell guy. And then there's a lot of conservative people that are going to relate to the Peter Enns, to the N.T. Wrights, to the Brian McLarens, people that they know have put in the time and can trust, people that they know are Christians, have proven to be Christians, but are now starting to think of things in new ways. But they get the foundation down where it's like, okay, I know you're a Christian, and maybe I can follow you in some of these more new directions. But I think that's interesting to think about when it comes to like change in any kind of tradition.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Another thing that I've noticed, though, when I do read some of these writers, specifically N.T. Wright and Rob Bell, I think Brian McLaren's a little different just because he's unapologetically progressive in the sense that he'll admit in his books that he is changing definitions and that he's like, oh, this doesn't work anymore, so we need to go to this, or maybe we need to start calling it this, and he'll say it outright. But Wright and Bell specifically, which honestly I think a lot of what Bell writes is kind of distilling N.T. Wright's work in a lot of ways. But what they do is actually they're kind of uncovering that has been the orthodoxy. Like they'll tell you over and over again through their work, like, this isn't new. This is fairly old, and they tie it into church history, especially N.T. Wright being Anglican. He very much cares about tying it into what did the church fathers believe and why were the creeds established and things like that. And it's interesting when you have these, we call them progressive ideas. We think they're new because we come from an evangelical mindset. We're thinking post-Reformation. We're 500 years in at the oldest, and actually recently I just found out this past week. So I am on staff at a Southern Baptist church. Don't get mad at me. But I was talking with the lead pastor at our church, and he's reading the biography of Martin Luther currently, and he this past week just had his world rocked because he found out that Martin Luther was one of the people that was arguing to take Revelation out of the scriptural canon. And he knew things like Martin Luther brewed beer, and things like that, simple stuff that you would think when you think of evangelical Christianity, people are against XYZ. But there are also things like
they're against brewing beer. Sorry.
Well,
No,
there are sects of Christianity, specifically Pentecostalism, that are they're known for being against alcohol, at least in the last, what would you say, probably 30 years or so.
Well, that's what happens because you started.
I thought you meant specifically brewing beer.
Oh, no, just drinking in general.
Oh, okay.
But the lead pastor of my church is now reading this and going, whoa, did you know that, like, Martin Luther, if we were talking about Revelation, like, he would totally disagree with me, Or Martin Luther actually believed that the bread and the wine, when you take communion or the Eucharist, were actually the physical blood and body of Christ. And
yeah, he was Catholic.
and a lot of evangelicals don't believe that now. And so to hear, like, I mean, he would have called evangelicals heretics because they didn't believe that, which is really interesting. So just kind of noting some of the changes that we've seen over the last 500 years, I think it's really interesting. And when we say things like new ways of thinking and things such as that, when we're talking about certain writers, like N.T. Wright or Rob Bell or Brian McLaren, a lot of the time they're tying what they're saying into early church fathers. They're tying it into the orthodoxy, which is really interesting to understand. Like when you actually start to break down the very recent history of when you say Christianity, what the general public thinks, it has been something that's very different up until very recently.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to my point. You have writers like N.T. Wright who have put in the time, like I said, and are willing to, take the time to connect their audience now with the thought process, with connecting it to the church fathers. And then you have, the Rob Bells and people who do that in certain ways. But, the revolutionaries, the early adopters, we can call them, the people that are very high in openness, people that are like really, idea people that are ready for the new thing now. It's like, I think there's a balance. I think you have to have some of those people to put things very clearly in a way that's very easily digestible and, move that group of people into the new sphere. But then you're going to have all these conservative stragglers who aren't so quick to throw away all their understandings. And you need the N.T. Wrights to say, let me walk through why our ideas today are very recent and why, the people that you look up to, like Martin Luther, would probably call you a heretic if he met you today. That's like a really big, like homiletical or preaching trope, that if Jesus was to come here today, what would he say? Well, he'd probably walk out of all of our churches and think that we're all doing it wrong. So I think we need the early adopters, the people that are very high on openness, who are like, no, the new idea, let's go. And he'll lead those people into, the new age or the new ways of thinking. And then you need the N.T. Wrights and the people who aren't so quick to just jump out and go to the new thing and are willing to slowly, patiently connect people to the tradition and inform and teach and educate people through the process, because some people are just going to get it when they hear it. They're going to be like, oh, yep, that makes sense. I'm out. Love wins. And then you're going to have people that are like, well, slow it down. Like, I've been taught this thing my entire life. I'm 60 years old. That's not, I'm not going to just abandon, all those years of foundation and belief and structure in my life. And you need those people to take people by the hand and patiently educate and show them the way. I think that's important.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. I think that's spot on. I mean, even if you think about some of the hurdles that the church has now ahead of us, such as, you see these gay affirming churches now, that would have never been a thing. That was never orthodox. Or even like Adam had mentioned earlier, women being ordained. That would have never been a thing, So there are certain aspects of, we're kind of waking up and realizing that whatever it probably does have to adapt and become whatever it's going to become in the future. And so, yeah, I agree. You definitely do need both. You need the people that are trailblazing, and you need the people that are kind of herding the flock, if you will, and kind of that way.
Isn't it the case that women still cannot become ordained priests in Catholicism?
Yes. In Catholicism, yeah. There's a lot of women preachers and pastors and like a lot of Protestant traditions.
Yeah, I know. Is it only?
I was going to say not
tested. What's that?
I mean, in
I said, is it
fundamental.
only Catholicism where that's the case?
I'm sure it's other places too.
No.
Even within mine, where there's a lot of women pastors today, because earlier I was talking about Pentecostalism. It's very much connected to the experience of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, all these things. So it's like if you have these evidences and you speak clearly and know the Bible, it's like, okay, you are obviously called. So there's been a lot of women leaders, pastors, preachers in Pentecostalism, but at the same time, in certain towns and certain locations, that's still not a thing or allowed. So it's a contested thing, which depends on geological location and
I
cultural.
remember the first time a woman served communion in our church, and how big a deal that was.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I've still never seen, not in the church that my parents go to, I don't think I've ever seen a female preacher from the pulpit. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's alive and well in many fundamental conservative Christian churches that elders are men and preachers are men and people that serve communion are men, and that's just the way it is. So
because Paul said,
yep.
Once again, geographic location,
culture, it always affects everything.
Yeah, my mom was a deacon.
Churches in California.
Oh, she was, Dusty?
Yeah, my mom was a deacon.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
That's awesome.
But was that in the black church?
No, this is in the Dutch church.
Oh.
We're not.
Well, I know. I mean, we're in Detroit. There's, I've been connected with a lot of like black churches. I work with a lot of them through like my work, and in a lot of black churches, women are a lot like it's a lot more likely to be like the preachers and pastors, like a lot of female pastors in that tradition, which is also a very varied thing that I have limited knowledge on. But I know that that's a thing there, very common.
I have a question. How fast is Godspeed?
Oh, the fastest.
Faster than the Flash. Read comic books, Godspeed is faster than the Flash.
Yeah, I hate all those like quasi philosophical, metaphysical questions. Like, can God pick up something heavier than himself? Like, it's just
No, I was just wondering because that's a term that had been used like in antiquity, Godspeed, if you're going along on a journey.
Are you wondering about the etymology of it?
Well, he's supposed to be omnipresent.
I'm just adding like a
all the time.
stupid joke. That's all it was.
Yeah.
No, let's flesh this out.
No,
How many
let's
angels
figure
can
this
dance on the head of a pin?
Oh.
not as many as you'd think. They like their space. Dusty, we're past 2 hours. I don't know how long these usually go, but it's getting late over here. Maybe we can wrap it up.
They usually go for like 4 hours.
Oh, do they?
No, well, sometimes it depends on the topic and how heated the conversation gets.
I don't feel like it
We
got
seem
heated.
No. It depends on if Sam's bulldog is here or not.
That's what I was just thinking.
No, Andrew and Ed at the same time.
Yeah. I sound like a Christian, and he sounds like an atheist when we argue about morality.
Well, I think
that's a start.
Well,
It's up to you, Bruce. Samuel, Hayden, Bruce, Samuel.
I mean, if anyone has any like last thoughts that they want to discuss, otherwise we can wrap this up. I mean, there's a lot of things that I wanted to get into, but I don't think that we'll get to, tonight. I'm sure we can have another conversation in the future. And I'm also playing with the idea of starting a Facebook group for the podcast so that we can have like more of these just to argue about fun stuff. But, because I'm working out what does pragmatic Christianity mean to me today with everything that we know. And I'm not going to be able to figure that out on my own. It's going to take conversations like these with people, and atheists and, people to bring in all the different perspectives.
I'm here for you.
So I really appreciate this. If there's anything that anyone else wants to discuss before we close, we can do that.
Next time, I don't know. Do you want to get Sam's Bulldog in on this?
I thought about inviting him. He was already invited. And I guess I don't know. I never talked to him about it, but
I'm surprised that
would,
he didn't want to
I didn't
participate. To
check
be honest,
Twitter.
I was
He
very
didn't
surprised.
chime in, so usually he chimes in the chat room for a link, so I'm not sure if he's
Ed.
busy today.
What's an ad?
What? Drew asked, "What's an Ed?" Ed is a force to be reckoned with.
Sounds like it. Hurricane Ed.
He's really into Sam Harris. Yeah,
Nice.
Big atheist. He's a fun time though.
Big atheist?
No, I don't think that big.
Not that big. All right.
But yeah, I like Ed. We're supposed to have a conversation, him, me, and Andrew soon. To drill me on what pragmatic Christianity is.
Yeah.
Like last time.
Yeah, if you want to wrap it up, it's certainly up to you.
All right.
Benediction?
Yeah, well, we're going to end with prayer.
Receive our benediction and depart in peace.
We're all going to hold virtual hands and pray this out. No, I just want to.
My favorite part of the church service, because I always knew he was going to say it, and then I would just kind of randomly say it to people, just like for no reason, just parroting it to people.
Yeah, me and Drew talked a little bit about like the different Christian cultural things that we did growing up on our podcast.
Yeah, that was a good one. That was my favorite episode.
That's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. All the weird little Christian things. I wasn't allowed to watch Pokemon.
Power Rangers.
Pokemon were the devil.
Really?
So my mom took. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna explain it real quick. This makes no sense. Pokemon means pocket monsters, but in Japan, apparently there's not a word for monster, so it's pocket demons. And in Eastern culture, demon is a different, more like, I don't know, there's just a whole other thing than what we imagine when we think of demon.
So one pastor
told us ridiculous stories about pocket demons, and we weren't allowed.
So my mom took all my Pokemon cards,
burned them,
and gave me some like Jurassic Park toy as like he's like,
you don't believe in that either. You don't believe in dinosaurs either.
Well, she thinks that Jesus and dinosaurs were living at the same time.
Didn't humans coexist with dinosaurs? Come on.
Obviously.
There's footprints in Australia. Come on, guys.
That is something, maybe.
What's wrong with Power Rangers, though?
I wasn't allowed to watch that either.
No Harry Potter. Come on now.
No Harry Potter.
It was because I stop hitting your sister. That's what's wrong with Power Rangers.
No Harry Potter, but Lord of the Rings is totally cool.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings was fine.
That's
because
funny.
He was buddies with C.S. Lewis. So I mean,
yeah, the author was a Christian.
Must be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
I would love to do another chat talking about all this cultural stuff that we're talking about right now, because I think that could be a really fun conversation, just how like culture plays into things, how culture plays into religion, and how religion has come up with so many weird, crazy cultures of their own. We can talk about snake handling and speaking in tongues.
Have you ever had any experience with that, or know anyone who has? Because I have no. I don't. As far as I'm concerned, I don't even think it's real.
I have a question.
No, it's definitely real. I've met people.
Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you guys have experience with this. I was in the Royal Rangers.
Oh yeah.
We had one of those dudes that was like on those God power teams or whatever. And he would like break bricks with his elbows and like blow up. Yeah, exactly. It was like one of our leaders in the Royal Rangers, and he'd like do these demonstrations like blowing up hot water bottles. Like we had one of those guys as one of our Royal Ranger leaders.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Royal Ranger code or motto? I really think you probably do.
I don't remember. That was like a long time ago.
Are you ready?
I don't remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
Don't? A Royal Ranger is alert, clean, honest, courageous, loyal, courteous, spiritual. And then there were like little things for each one. And then there was a Royal Ranger motto. I don't remember what that was. But Chris was in Awana. It's the same thing.
Awana.
It was called Royal Ambassadors in the Baptist.
Royal Ambassadors.
Yeah.
You liberals.
You liberal Baptists.
Oh man.
Yeah, but I thought the guy was great, just like breaking bricks and stuff, like running
That's
through
so
the brick
fun.
walls.
Yeah, I had one of those guys at my church. He was also Mr. Michigan at one point, but he was one of those guys.
Yeah, that
I
dude was
got-
a celebrity, man. Everyone
Yeah.
that knew him was like, I know that guy.
Brian Dorsey.
Yeah.
We saw him at Christian festivals.
Yeah. He let me in his trailer. I went to a Christian festival one time, and
With
they were
me.
there, and I like was in his trailer with them, and we were hanging out because he went to my church growing up, and he was like, "Are you hungry?" I was like, not really, but you know, actually, I am a little hungry." He's like, he opens up his food pantry. It's all potatoes. He eats 15 potatoes a day because he's humongous. He has to just keep just downing carbs. And he's like, all I have is potatoes, and I don't put anything on it. So if you want to eat a potato with me, I'm like, I guess I'm eating a raw potato. He just
Raw
like eats it
potatoes?
like, yeah, he just eats it like candy
Or an apple.
and protein.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Jeez.
fun times. Royal Rangers. I learned how to start a fire. at
Potatoes
Royal
and
Rangers.
protein shakes. That's what I
Not
was
the right
eating.
way.
Not the right way.
I started fires in Royal Rangers, not the right way.
We built rockets. It was fun. My dad was a Royal Ranger leader.
Commander Bruce.
Yeah, the guy who was breaking bricks, he was Commander John.
Yeah,
I
my
like
dad was
that.
Commander Dennis, and to like make an example of me, like if he's like, I can't give you favoritism, so like if I did anything, he'd put me in the corner. I'd have to like stare at the corner, like in the middle of like all my friends. I'm like, come on, Dad.
No nepotism.
So I'm with Luther. I got daddy issues. Sticking me in the corner.
My dad knew better than to be my Royal Ranger commander.
So yeah, if anyone has anything else to say, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry, guys.
I like you guys.
How do you
Everyone-
usually wrap it?
Everyone go ahead and do your plugs. I guess Andrew
yeah.
could go first so he can give you an example of that.
Sure. Yeah. If anyone wants to, they can check out my YouTube channel, Mindgasms. I do podcasts. I've talked to Hayden on there before, and Dusty, and Sam's Bulldog, and I do other videos. And I also publish I read my novel chapters on there, and I have my own blog, mindgasms.theblogpress.com, if anyone wants to check it out. And also, I'm on the social medias, the Facebooky Booha and the Twitter at Andrew Meitzer. My last name is a weird German spelling, Meintzer. And that's pretty much it, I think.
Nice shirt.
Oh, yeah. I've also got the Mixed Mental Arts Callan Fate shirt here.
Oh, nice.
Everyone should follow the Callan Fate.
So good.
All right, Chris, you have any plugs?
Nope.
All right. I know Hayden's got some plugs.
Yep. We got the Pragmatic Christian podcast, the pragmaticchristian.com. The Twitter is at Pragmatic Christ. I got the comment section on the website, and I want to try to get people to start, discussing the topics at the bottom of the pages. So anyone listening, you can discuss the podcast, the topics on the webpage for each episode, or on Twitter. I'm involved in Mixed Mental Arts, and I'm going to start publishing articles by me and other people that are going to get involved with my website and what I'm doing. I really am trying to create a conversation very much like the one we had today about these things. I'm trying to process what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be religious in today's climate with everything that we know in an intellectually honest way. And yeah, so you can go listen to the podcast, go to the website, and see me around on Mixed Mental Arts.
And you can follow me and any artistic endeavors or media stuff at Drew_B as in boy, ORO, at Drew Borrow. on Instagram and Twitter, pretty much, or at Donald J. Trump. No, don't. That's pretty much it. I'm doing this and have some other projects coming up. So fun stuff. We have a YouTube channel coming up.
Drew does a lot of stuff. He produces a lot of things for other people. He does media at his church, videos, podcasts, all sorts of different random stuff.
It's been fun.
So he's around.
Yeah, I'm around.
All right, great. And I'll go ahead and plug my stuff. I'm the woke centrist everywhere. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube as well. Yes, I haven't posted anything in a long goddamn time, but tomorrow I'm actually going to shoot the video that I lost when my hard drive died.
Oh man!
So I'm gonna reshoot that whole video, and then we're gonna get rolling on that.
Is it gonna be another Black Rednecks and White Liberals video?
Yeah, it's gonna be on the true history of slavery.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's coming up. Hopefully, I'm shooting it. I'm not sure how long editing's gonna take because I'm pretty egregious in what I do in those videos. So I'd say sometime, hopefully this month. And make sure to like and subscribe this channel. Follow us on Instagram and everywhere else, Twitter, Facebook. We're called Mixed Mental Arts, part of the Brian Callen Show, but the Brian Callen Show is part of Mixed Mental Arts. So if you really want to keep up on things, Facebook is good. We also have a website at the bottom of the website if you want to help contribute without spending anything outside of what you ordinarily would spend on Amazon. We have a Amazon link there at the bottom, and that will greatly help us out. We also got a Patreon page at Mixed Mental Arts. And thank you very much. Next week, I don't know what I have planned, but I'll keep you guys updated. I know in 2 weeks we're going to be talking about Behave, the book by Robert Sapolsky.
Hey.
Yeah, I know Andrew's looking really forward to that. But
I got a week to read it then.
Oh man, it's a dense book.
I know. I just went back to Joe Hendrick's book, The Secret of Our Success. I got halfway through, understood the premise, and haven't picked it up in like probably a year. And I'm like, I got to finish that book because it's so important. So maybe I'll put it down and breeze through Behave as fast as I can.
Yeah, Behave it's super dense, especially the first half of the book. It's just a bunch of technical jargon and terminology. So it's dense. It took me, I read it. Well, I didn't read it. I listened to it. I'd probably have absorbed more reading, but I'll try to remember what I read and be active in that conversation when it comes up. And I'll probably watch a bunch of Robert Sapolsky videos. As if you just look at his videos that he has posted of his many lectures, a lot of what he says have come out of his many lectures that he has online. So
yeah, you can see his Stanford lectures on YouTube. Those are very helpful.
Yeah, a lot of those lectures are pretty much retold in the book. So if
is it kind of like Jordan Peterson that if you like listen to his lectures, you pretty much don't have to buy the book?
I would say
I think so. Jordan Peterson's weird, though.
There is a lot more information in the book, though.
Okay.
Yeah, the book puts it in a very great chronological order.
Yeah.
You know, from beginning to end. You know, just how behavior starts before you're even a living human being, and then it kind of progresses past that point. But yeah, it's a great book. But we will be talking about that in 2 weeks. Next week, actually, you know what? Next week we're going to do a free for all. So that's just whatever topics we want to talk about.
Chris, you're great. Thanks for laughing at jokes.
All right. So everybody, thank you for sticking around. We'll be here next week, Saturday, 6:30, just like the usual time. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Hell yeah. Godspeed.